In March 2006, in a quiet Iraqi town, a crime unfolded so brutal it shocked the world. 4 U.S. soldiers, 1 family, and an act that would stain the war's history forever. This is the true story of betrayal, violence, and the chilling path from uniform to atrocity. In the spring of 2006, Iraq was in the grip of relentless violence. The war had dragged on for 3 years, and certain stretches of land were known to soldiers and civilians alike as places where danger never slept. One such place, a cluster of towns and farmland southwest of Baghdad, was grimly referred to as the Triangle of Death. It was a patchwork of rural roads, concrete homes, and hidden threats, where U.S. Army patrols moved under constant tension and local families tried to survive from one day to the next. The town of Yusufia lay in the heart of this area. Life here was modest fields of crops, small markets, and tightly knit family homes, each with its own rhythms and routines. Among the residents was the Al-Janabi family. The father, Qasim Hamza Rahim Al-Janabi, was a man in his 40s who worked the land to provide for his family. His wife, Fakriya Taha Muhazen, in her 30s, kept the household running and cared for their 2 daughters. 14-year-old Abir Qasim Hamza Al-Janabi was in school. Known for her shy manner and the quiet dignity she carried despite the chaos surrounding their village. Her little sister, Hadil, was just 6 years old, full of the boundless energy and innocence that should have been safe from the ugliness of war. Just 200 meters from the Al-Janabi home, a small military checkpoint was manned by soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division. They were young men from the United States, trained for combat but spending long days in the oppressive heat, scanning roads for roadside bombs and watching the faces of passers-by for signs of danger. Among them were Private First Class Stephen Dale Green, age 21. Specialist Paul E. Cortez, age 23. Sergeant James P. Barker, age 23. Specialist Jesse V. Spielman, age 22. And Private First Class Brian L. Howard, age 19. They had come to Iraq wearing the uniform of their country, but under the constant strain of fear, boredom, and hostility, lines of discipline and morality began to blur for some. The soldiers had seen the Al-Janabi family before. From their post, they had noticed Abir walking outside. Some made crude remarks about her appearance. The war zone had twisted certain minds, and respect for civilians was eroding under the weight of long deployments and the dehumanizing nature of occupation. This poisonous attitude would eventually fuel a plan so dark it would stain the reputation of their entire unit. The checkpoint routine was repetitive. Hours of scanning traffic, patrolling dusty roads, and dealing with the constant threat of attack. When the danger seemed quiet, soldiers passed the time in small, private ways. On March 12, 2006, the day began like many others, but in the cramped space of their post, something sinister was forming. Alcohol, forbidden under military rules, was being passed around. Cards were played. Boredom mixed with recklessness. And as the drink loosened their tongues, the conversation turned to Abir. It wasn't the first time her name had been mentioned among them, but now, in the hazy mix of liquor and lawlessness, their talk turned into something far worse, an idea to take her by force. The discussion was not the talk of soldiers acting under orders or for any military objective. It was raw and personal, the thinking of men who saw an opportunity to indulge their darkest impulses. Green, who had already displayed disturbing behavior in Iraq, spoke openly about wanting to kill Iraqi civilians. Others in the group listened and, in a fatal failure of judgment, began agreeing to the plan. Cortez, Barker, and Spielman were drawn into the scheme. Howard, the youngest at 19, was told to act as a lookout and driver, aware of the plan but not intending to join the assault itself. The Al-Janabi family had no idea what was coming. Life in Yusufia was already dangerous, with insurgent attacks and military raids a regular part of the landscape. But the threat that day would come not from shadowy fighters but from uniformed soldiers sworn to protect civilians under the laws of war. When the decision was made, Green changed out of his uniform into dark clothing. It was an attempt to disguise himself, to step outside his official role while still carrying the authority and weaponry of a U.S. soldier. The group left their post without authorization, moving toward the Al-Janabi home with weapons ready. They crossed the short distance between the checkpoint and the small house, stepping from the role of soldiers into that of predators. The plan was simple in its cruelty. Isolate the family, take a beer, and silence anyone who could speak about it. What none of them considered, or perhaps cared about, was the irreversible destruction they were about to inflict, not only on one household but on the already fragile trust between occupying troops and the civilians among whom they lived. Up to this point, the events were invisible to the outside world. Other soldiers at the checkpoint did not yet know what had been set in motion. No radio call had gone out. No report had been filed. The war had made violence a part of daily life, but this was different. This was premeditated, personal, and driven by something far darker than the rules of engagement. What happened next would be over in a matter of minutes, but it would burn itself into the memory of Iraq's war years and later emerge as one of the most shocking criminal cases involving U.S. forces. The Al-Janabi home, a modest shelter that had withstood the storms of conflict, was about to become the scene of an act so brutal it would echo far beyond Yusufia, reaching courtrooms, headlines, and history books. The sun hung high over Yusufia that afternoon, casting harsh light across the dusty streets and low houses. Inside the Al-Janabi home, the day was ordinary in its rhythm. Qasim, the father, was present, as were his wife, Fakriya, and their daughters, 14-year-old Abir and 6-year-old Hadil. The family had endured the daily tension of living so close to an American checkpoint, but nothing in their experience could have prepared them for the knock on the door, or the way it came without warning. The group of soldiers approached the small home from the checkpoint. They carried rifles, and their boots pressed into the dirt path leading up to the front entrance. They had no authorization for what they were about to do. Their intent was hidden under the guise of armed presence. But to them, the moment was already stripped of any military purpose. Green, dressed in dark clothing instead of his uniform, moved with a deliberate confidence. Barker, Cortez, Spielman, and Howard followed, each aware of the plan, each crossing a moral boundary that could never be uncrossed. Howard remained outside. He was the lookout, the one assigned to watch for anyone who might approach, to give a warning if another patrol came by or if neighbors grew suspicious. Spielman stayed closer to the door, positioned to help control the scene inside. Green, Barker, and Cortez stepped into the family's living space. The door shut behind them, cutting off the small house from the world outside. The confrontation was immediate. Green separated Qasim and Hadil from the rest of the family, ordering them into a bedroom. The command carried the force of an armed soldier, and resistance was dangerous. Inside that room, Green raised his weapon and shot the father and the youngest daughter. In an instant, 2 lives were gone. The sound of gunfire in a war zone might not always draw attention from beyond the walls, but inside the house, it was devastating. Fakriya, the mother, was forced into another room. Green followed and another shot rang out. She collapsed, leaving only Abir alive. In the space of moments, the teenager had lost her entire immediate family. She was now alone in the presence of 3 armed soldiers. While Green was in the other rooms, Cortez and Barker turned their attention to Abir. They pulled her toward the living area. There, away from her family's bodies but within the same small home, they assaulted her. The act was not rushed. It was deliberate, carried out while the others secured the scene. Spielman remained close, keeping control of the house and the situation. When the assault ended, Green returned. The decision was made to kill Abir. Whether it was to silence her or simply the final step in a plan already determined, Green lifted his weapon once more and shot her in the head. She fell where she stood, the last of the family's voices silenced. The soldiers moved quickly to erase what they could of the crime. They poured kerosene on Abir's body and set it alight. The flames consumed her clothing and flesh, the smoke rising inside the small home. The fire was meant to destroy evidence, to make identification and investigation more difficult. It was a crude attempt at concealment, carried out with the same coldness as the acts that had come before it. When they were done, they left the house as they had come, moving back toward the checkpoint. The walk was short, but in those few steps, the line between soldier and criminal was crossed beyond return. They rejoined their post as though nothing had happened. The bodies inside the home would not be discovered immediately by outsiders, but the damage had been done, and the violence would not remain hidden forever. In the hours after, the Al-Janabi house was quiet except for the crackle of smoldering remains. Neighbors and locals eventually discovered the scene. In a war where death was common, the sight still shocked them, the family gone, the teenager's body burned, and the attack clearly targeted, not the result of crossfire or bombing. At first, the natural assumption was that insurgents were to blame. In Iraq at that time, there was no shortage of armed groups willing to commit brutality. The presence of U.S. troops so close to the house was noted but not immediately linked to the crime. Back at the checkpoint, the soldiers blended back into their routine. The incident was not reported. They carried on as if nothing had happened, guarding roads, checking vehicles, and speaking over the radio in the clipped language of military procedure. To their fellow soldiers who had no knowledge of what had just occurred, there was no sign of the massacre that had taken place only a few hundred meters away. But the crime had already begun to cast a shadow. The small distance between the checkpoint and the Al-Janabi home meant that rumors would soon circulate. Locals who had seen the soldiers near the house that day would remember. The brutality of the killings and the assault would lodge in the community's memory, adding to the already deep resentment toward the foreign troops. In the immediate aftermath, the official record of the day did not change. There was no patrol report describing an encounter at the Al-Janabi home. The chain of command received no notification of any unusual incident in that sector. For now, the soldiers' secret was safe, hidden under the noise of a war that produced tragedy every day. Yet secrecy in such crimes rarely lasts. The truth has a way of surfacing, through words spoken in confidence, through the conscience of those who know, or through the persistence of investigators who refuse to accept the simplest explanation. In the weeks that followed, the killings would remain officially unsolved. The initial blame rested on insurgents, and the war moved forward. But the events of March 12th were far from over. The moment Green, Cortez, Barker, Spielman, and Howard stepped into that house, they set in motion a chain of consequences that would reach far beyond the dirt roads of Yusufia, into military courtrooms, news reports, and history itself. In the days and weeks after the murders, the official story was that insurgents had been responsible. This explanation fit the environment of the time. Yusufia and the surrounding area were no strangers to violent attacks. Reports were filed, patrols continued, and the war moved on. The soldiers who had committed the crime blended back into the rhythms of military life, keeping their secret close. For a while, it seemed the truth might never be known. But secrets of this magnitude rarely remain buried. In the months that followed, small cracks began to appear in the wall of silence. The first shift came not from local witnesses or Iraqi investigators, but from within the ranks of the U.S. military itself. Stephen Green, already known among some fellow soldiers for his erratic and aggressive behavior, began speaking openly to others. During conversations unrelated to the March 12th incident, he let slip disturbing comments about killing Iraqis and, eventually, about what had happened to the Al-Janabi family. His words carried the weight of someone bragging, not confessing, and that made them even more chilling. By June 2006, Green was no longer in the army. He had been discharged on the grounds of a personality disorder and returned to the United States. This made the situation more complicated. As a civilian, he was outside the reach of military justice. But his casual admissions to another soldier about the rape and murders in Yusufia could not be ignored. The soldier he spoke to decided to come forward, reporting what he had heard. This act broke open the case. Military investigators began to dig into the events of March 12th. The accounts they gathered pointed toward the small group from the 101st Airborne Division. The details matched. The proximity of the checkpoint to the Al-Janabi home, the soldiers seen near the property that day, and the brutality of the crime. One by one, members of the group were questioned. Under the pressure of interrogation, the full story began to emerge. The investigation revealed the roles of each man. Green had shot the parents, the 6-year-old sister, and Abir herself, and had participated in the assault. Cortez and Barker had taken part in the rape. Spielman had helped carry out the plan and keep control inside the house. Howard had served as the lookout, aware of the plan but not directly assaulting Abir. Their movements, the sequence of the killings, and the attempt to burn Abir's body with kerosene all came into focus. The evidence was damning. While in uniform and in full knowledge of their actions, these soldiers had left their post without authorization, committed multiple murders, and carried out the rape of a child. The crime had been deliberate, premeditated, and concealed until one of their own spoke out. Since Green was now a civilian, the U.S. military could not court-martial him. Instead, he was arrested by the FBI and charged in a U.S. federal court under the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, which allows the prosecution of former military personnel for crimes committed overseas. The others, Cortez, Barker, Spielman, and Howard, were tried within the military justice system. The trials laid bare the facts of the case. Witnesses from within the unit described the atmosphere at the checkpoint, the alcohol consumption, and the conversations that led to the attack. Forensic evidence and Iraqi witness testimony confirmed the brutality at the Al-Janabi home. The defense could not undo the weight of the soldiers' own admissions. In the end, the outcomes were stark. Stephen Green was found guilty in federal court and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Years later, in 2014, he would take his own life in prison, leaving behind no apology, only the record of his conviction. James P. Barker and Paul E. Cortez, both of whom pleaded guilty in military court to avoid the death penalty, were sentenced to life in prison. Cortez received the possibility of parole after 10 years, Barker after 20. Jesse V. Spielman, who maintained a lesser role in the direct violence but participated in the crime, was sentenced to 110 years in prison. Brian L. Howard, who served as the lookout and did not enter the house, was convicted of conspiracy and failing to report the crime. He received 27 months in prison. The sentencing closed the legal chapter of the case, but the damage went far beyond courtrooms and prisons. The Mahmudiyya rape and killings became a symbol of everything that could go wrong when discipline breaks down in a combat zone. For Iraqis, it was another wound in a war that had already claimed so many innocent lives. The Al-Janabi family's home, once a modest place of safety, was left in ruins, its memory tied forever to the violence of that day. For the U.S. military, it was a scandal that stained the reputation of the many soldiers who served honorably in the same region. The theme of the case was as clear as it was disturbing: the corruption of morality under the pressures of war. The brutality and dehumanization that can grow in such an environment, when left unchecked, can lead to atrocities against the very civilians a military force is sworn to protect. It was also a warning about the abuse of power, how, without discipline and accountability, those entrusted with authority can turn it toward the most personal and horrific acts. In Yusufia, people still remembered Abir, her parents, and little Hadil. Their story was retold as both a tragedy and a warning. Even as Iraq continued to face conflict, the memory of March 12, 2006, endured. For those who knew the family, the loss was personal. For those who studied the war, it was a case study in moral collapse. And for the surviving members of the Al-Janabi extended family, it was a grief that would never fully heal. The war moved on, but the Mahmudiyya case remained in the record, a reminder that even in the chaos of conflict, individual choices matter. The soldiers at the checkpoint had been given weapons to defend their post, not to destroy a family. Their decision to step into that house set in motion a chain of events that would destroy lives, shatter trust, and reverberate through history. With the trials concluded and the sentences handed down, the case entered the archive of war crimes committed during the Iraq conflict. It stood alongside other incidents as a grim reminder that the battlefield is not only measured by territory gained or lost, but by the moral lines held or crossed by those who fight there. In this case, those lines had been crossed completely, and the cost had been paid in the most personal and irreversible way possible. The story of the Mahmudiyya rape and killings ends not with resolution, but with a lingering weight. The legal system could punish the perpetrators, but it could not undo what had been done. In the quiet spaces of Yusufia, where the wind still moves through fields and dust still settles on concrete walls, the memory of that day remains, a shadow that no sentence or verdict can fully lift.
On a freezing New Year's Eve in Michigan, Army Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III stepped outside to bring food to his wife. Seconds later, gunfire ended his life. What seemed a senseless killing would unravel into a shocking tale of betrayal, lust, and a cold, calculated murder plot. It was the holiday season of 2018 in St. Joseph Township, Michigan. The small community along the shores of Lake Michigan was quiet, wrapped in winter stillness. Families were gathering for New Year's Eve celebrations, preparing to welcome another year. For the Hassel family, the holidays meant something special that year. Their son, Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III, was home from his post at Fort Stewart, Georgia. Tyrone was just 23 years old, but he had already built a reputation for discipline, dedication, and leadership. As a U.S. Army sergeant, he took pride in his service. He had a wife, 22-year-old Kimia Hassel, who was also a soldier stationed at Fort Stewart. Together, they had a young toddler son. Tyrone's life seemed to be on a solid path, a loving marriage, a growing family, and a promising military career. Friends and family saw Tyrone as dependable, ambitious, and devoted to his loved ones. His father, Tyrone Hassel Jr., often spoke about his son's determination and strong work ethic. To those around them, Tyrone and Kimia appeared to be a young couple making their way through the challenges of military life together, supporting each other while raising a child. But beneath the surface, the reality was far darker. At Fort Stewart, away from the watchful eyes of family, Kimia had been growing close to another soldier, 24-year-old Specialist Jeremy Cuellar. What started as casual conversation turned into something more. Before long, they were having an affair. The two shared not only a physical attraction, but also intimate conversations about their feelings, frustrations, and dreams of being together without Tyrone in the picture. The relationship between Kimia and Jeremy wasn't just a fleeting distraction. It became the center of their conversations and their plans. They began discussing the obstacles in their way, namely Tyrone. In time, their talks took a disturbing turn. The idea of removing Tyrone from their lives permanently emerged. For them, it wasn't only about being together. Kimia stood to gain financially if Tyrone were gone. As a military spouse, she would be eligible for life insurance benefits and other financial support tied to his death. These discussions hardened into a plan. Kimia and Jeremy decided that Jeremy would be the one to carry out the killing. He would travel from Georgia to Michigan while the couple was visiting Tyrone's family for the holidays. Kimia would stay close to Tyrone, appearing as the supportive wife, so no suspicion would fall on her. Throughout December, while holiday plans were unfolding for most families, a far different plan was unfolding between Kimia and Jeremy. They talked about timing, method, and how to make sure no one connected them to the crime. By the time New Year's Eve approached, the details were in place. On December 31, 2018, Tyrone spent the evening with his family at his father's home in St. Joseph Township. It was a warm gathering filled with food, laughter, and anticipation of midnight celebrations. Kimia was there as well, blending into the family environment. The night carried all the hallmarks of a normal holiday visit, except for what was waiting outside. Jeremy had arrived in Michigan and was lying in wait nearby. He knew the routine. At some point during the evening, Tyrone would step outside. The opportunity came when Tyrone prepared to bring food to Kimia, who was sitting in their car. It was cold outside, and the walk to the car seemed ordinary, a small act of care from a husband to his wife. But as Tyrone reached the vehicle, Jeremy emerged from hiding. Without warning, he ambushed Tyrone, firing multiple shots. The sound of gunfire shattered the quiet of the winter night. Tyrone fell to the ground, mortally wounded. He died there, steps away from the family celebration, never knowing that the plot against him had been set in motion by the person he trusted most. The shock of the murder rippled instantly through the Hassel family. Police and emergency crews arrived quickly, but it was too late. The young sergeant was gone. In those first hours, grief overwhelmed everyone. No one suspected that Kimia was involved. She stayed composed, participating in the mourning, even standing beside Tyrone's relatives as they struggled to make sense of the senseless. For the community, the loss was heartbreaking. Tyrone was well known and respected, not only as a soldier, but as a son, father, and friend. People spoke about his discipline, his commitment to family, and the bright future that had been stolen from him. The randomness of the attack puzzled investigators at first. Why would someone target Tyrone? There were no signs of robbery, no personal disputes that anyone could recall. In those early days, police began the painstaking work of piecing together what had happened. They spoke to family members, friends, and fellow soldiers. They examined Tyrone's phone records, social media activity, and communications from the days leading up to the murder. What they found in those first steps would open the door to a deeper, more disturbing truth, one that no one in Tyrone's family could have imagined. The investigation was about to shift from the search for an unknown gunman to the exposure of a betrayal that cut to the core of the victim's life. But in those first days after the shooting, that truth was still hidden, and Kimia Hassel was still playing the part of the grieving widow. The next phase of the case, the one that would reveal the secret relationship, the murder plot, and the cold calculation behind it, was just beginning to take shape. Investigators had started to see patterns, names, and messages that would soon turn suspicion in a new and shocking direction. In the days following the murder, detectives from St. Joseph Township and surrounding agencies worked through the shock and confusion to try to understand why a young Army sergeant had been gunned down outside his father's home. At first, they treated it as a targeted killing, but without a clear motive. Tyrone Hassel III had no known enemies, no history of trouble, and no signs of involvement in anything that might have put him in danger. The crime scene offered few immediate answers. There was no sign of robbery. Tyrone's wallet and personal belongings were untouched. The shooting seemed deliberate, almost surgical in its execution, as if the gunman had been waiting for that exact moment. Witness accounts from the neighborhood were limited. Most people had been indoors, celebrating New Year's Eve. Investigators began by mapping out Tyrone's last days, who he had been with, and who had known his movements. His phone records were pulled, and social media activity was examined. What appeared at first to be routine checks soon revealed patterns that caught the attention of detectives. Certain numbers appeared repeatedly in Kimia Hassel's communications, one of them belonging to Specialist Jeremy Cuellar, another soldier stationed at Fort Stewart. The frequency and timing of these messages stood out. Calls and texts between Kimia and Jeremy were constant, even during the holiday trip to Michigan. On the day of the murder, there had been multiple exchanges between them, including shortly before and after the shooting. Detectives also reached out to military contacts at Fort Stewart. They learned that Kimia and Jeremy were often seen together on base. While nothing about their interactions had officially raised alarms in the military setting, whispers of a possible relationship began to surface. Fellow soldiers recalled seeing them talking privately, spending time together outside of duty hours. The deeper investigators dug, the more a picture began to form, one that pointed away from the idea of a random attack and toward something far more personal. Surveillance footage from travel hubs and nearby locations added to that picture. It placed Jeremy in Michigan around the time of the murder, far from his post in Georgia. For detectives, this was a breakthrough. Jeremy had no family in Michigan, no clear reason to be there, unless it was connected to the killing. Travel records showed he had left Georgia in the days before New Year's Eve and returned shortly after. His trip aligned almost perfectly with the timeline of Tyrone's death. Meanwhile, interviews with friends and acquaintances began to uncover troubling details. Some recalled hearing Kimia complain about her marriage, about Tyrone's demands and their lifestyle. Others mentioned that she seemed particularly close to Jeremy. One witness even claimed that Kimia had spoken openly, though perhaps jokingly at the time, about wanting Tyrone dead. The cumulative effect of these findings shifted the investigation's focus entirely. Detectives now believed they were dealing with a murder for hire or a conspiracy between lovers. The pieces, constant secret communication, an unexplained trip, and suspicious statements were falling into place. To build their case, investigators pressed forward quietly. They did not want to alert Kimia or Jeremy that they were under scrutiny. For days, they monitored phone records, gathered electronic evidence, and pieced together timelines. The digital trail was damning. Text messages between Kimia and Jeremy contained coded language that, when viewed alongside the other evidence, suggested planning and coordination. The motive became clearer as detectives looked into military benefits. If Tyrone were killed, Kimia would be entitled to substantial life insurance payouts and survivor benefits. Combined with her relationship with Jeremy, this financial incentive added a powerful layer to the motive. When police were confident they had enough to confront the suspects, they moved in. Jeremy was approached first. Taken into custody, he initially denied any involvement. But confronted with the travel records, the phone logs, and the knowledge that investigators could place him near the crime scene, his resistance began to crumble. It was during these interrogations that the full outline of the murder plot began to emerge. Jeremy admitted he had been involved, that he had come to Michigan with the sole purpose of killing Tyrone. He described how Kimia had encouraged and directed him, how they had discussed the timing, and how she had positioned herself as an alibi while he carried out the ambush. His account detailed the coordination on the night of December 31st. Kimia had ensured Tyrone would step outside, giving Jeremy the opportunity to strike. From his hiding spot, Jeremy waited for Tyrone to approach the car before pulling the trigger. He described fleeing the scene and returning to Georgia, where he and Kimia continued their contact as though nothing had happened. Even with Jeremy's admissions, investigators continued to gather corroborating evidence. They wanted the case against Kimia to be airtight. Phone data showed her exact locations during key moments, proving she was in constant touch with Jeremy in the lead-up to the murder. The timing of calls and texts fit perfectly with the sequence of events described by Jeremy. Back in Michigan, Kimia maintained her role as the grieving widow. She attended gatherings, spoke with police as though she were desperate for answers, and kept up appearances. But the evidence against her was mounting, and detectives knew her arrest was inevitable. The betrayal at the heart of the case was staggering for Tyrone's family. To think that the woman he had married, the mother of his child, had conspired to have him killed was almost beyond comprehension. The young sergeant who had served his country with honor had been targeted not by a stranger, but by those closest to him. As investigators prepared for the final steps, the case had transformed completely from its early days. What had seemed like an inexplicable act of violence now had a clear narrative, a secret affair, a calculated plan, and a cold execution on a winter night. The only remaining task for law enforcement was to bring the full truth into the open and hold both Kimia Hassel and Jeremy Cuellar accountable for their roles in the killing. The arrests were the final act in the investigation's turning point. But the story of how the lovers' plot unraveled in court and the sentences that would follow was still to come. When the time came to move in on the suspects, detectives acted swiftly. Jeremy Cuellar was already in custody and had begun to cooperate. His statements gave investigators a direct path to Kimia Hassel, and the evidence trail they had built left little room for doubt. The coordinated communication, the travel records, the surveillance footage, and Jeremy's confession all pointed to her as the driving force behind the murder. Kimia was arrested in early 2019. To those who had seen her in the days after Tyrone's death, her sudden arrest was shocking. She had played the part of the bereaved widow, without a visible crack in her composure. She attended family gatherings, spoke softly about her husband's memory, and even stood with Tyrone's grieving father. But behind that facade was a series of calculated moves, conversations, messages, and plans that had led to his death. In the interrogation room, Kimia maintained her innocence at first. She denied being involved in the killing, denied that her relationship with Jeremy was anything more than a friendship, and denied any knowledge of a plan. But detectives had come prepared. Piece by piece, they laid out the evidence. The phone logs, the GPS locations, the message history, the timeline that aligned her actions with Jeremy's movements. Jeremy's confession was the most damning piece. He had told investigators that Kimia was the mastermind, that she had convinced him Tyrone stood in the way of their future together, and that she would benefit financially from his death. He described the conversations they had about life insurance, the money that would come in if Tyrone died, and how they could use it to start a new life. According to Jeremy, Kimia had been clear about the timing. She told him when they would be in Michigan for the holidays, when Tyrone would be spending time with his family, and how she would make sure Tyrone stepped outside alone. On the night of the murder, she messaged Jeremy to confirm the moment was right. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, Kimia's denials began to falter, but she never gave a full confession. The case moved quickly toward trial. For prosecutors, the evidence was a rare combination of physical proof, digital records, and direct testimony from a co-conspirator. The trial drew significant public attention. In the courtroom, Tyrone's family sat together, listening to every detail of the plot that had taken their son's life. Prosecutors laid out the timeline from the first signs of the affair at Fort Stewart to the final shots fired in the cold Michigan night. They presented the messages between Kimia and Jeremy, showing how the coded words were, in reality, instructions and confirmations about the killing. Jeremy took the stand for the prosecution. His testimony was steady and specific. He described the affair in detail, how it had deepened over time, and how Kimia began speaking about wanting Tyrone out of the picture. He admitted to pulling the trigger, but placed the planning squarely on her shoulders. The jury heard how he had flown to Michigan, hidden near the house, and waited for the moment she had orchestrated. Prosecutors emphasized the calculated nature of the crime. This was not a moment of passion, they argued, but a premeditated act designed for personal gain. The motive was not only to be with each other, but to claim the financial benefits that would follow Tyrone's death. Kimia's defense team tried to undermine Jeremy's credibility, portraying him as someone who acted alone and was now blaming her to reduce his own punishment. They suggested that the evidence was circumstantial, that the messages could be interpreted in multiple ways, and that there was no definitive proof Kimia had ordered the killing. But the jury had more than just messages. They had Jeremy's travel records, his confession, and a sequence of events that fit together too precisely to be coincidence. After days of testimony, the jury returned its verdict. Kimia Hassel was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The conviction meant an automatic sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jeremy Cuellar, who had already pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for his cooperation, was sentenced to prison as well, facing decades behind bars. For Tyrone's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but no real closure. His father spoke after the sentencing, describing the pain of losing a son who had been dedicated to his family and his service. He expressed disbelief that the betrayal had come from within the family, from the woman Tyrone had trusted to stand beside him in life. The courtroom scene at sentencing was heavy with emotion. Family members gave statements about Tyrone's character, his work ethic, and the bright future that had been cut short. They spoke of his dedication to his son, his pride in his military service, and the hole his death had left in their lives. Kimia showed little visible emotion as the life sentence was read. She was led from the courtroom in silence, beginning a life behind bars for a crime that had stunned both her family and the military community. Jeremy's role, while secondary in planning, had been essential in execution, and his cooperation had ensured the full story came to light. The case of the love triangle murder of Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III left a lasting mark on the community of St. Joseph Township. It was a story of deception hidden in plain sight, of a relationship that turned into a conspiracy, and of a calculated killing carried out on a holiday meant for celebration. It showed how personal motives, love, desire, and greed could intertwine into a deadly plan. For investigators, the case was a reminder of how digital evidence can unravel even the most carefully constructed lies. The phone records, the GPS data, and the travel timelines had been critical in turning suspicion into proof. For the family, it was a harsh lesson in how trust can be shattered in ways they never imagined. Years later, the facts of the case remain stark. A young soldier, home for the holidays, was gunned down not by chance, but by design. The person who orchestrated it shared his home, his child, and his life. And the man who pulled the trigger had been brought into that home as a friend. The love triangle murder of Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III stands as a chilling account of betrayal and premeditation, ending in the ultimate act of violence. The justice system brought convictions and sentences, but for those who knew Tyrone, the loss is permanent. The story's final chapter is not in the court documents or the prison records, but in the memories of the family and friends who remember the man he was, a son, a father, and a soldier whose life was taken far too soon. On a quiet Sunday night in Auburn, Alabama, 3 police officers answered a routine domestic disturbance call. Minutes later, gunfire tore through the darkness, leaving 1 officer dead, 2 wounded, and a city in shock. This is the chilling true story of an ambush no one saw coming. It was late on a quiet Sunday evening in Auburn, Alabama, May 19, 2019, when the call came in to the Auburn Police Division. A report of a domestic disturbance in the Arrowhead Park neighborhood. Nothing unusual on the surface, yet every officer on duty knew these calls could be unpredictable. Domestic disputes were among the most dangerous calls to answer. Dispatch relayed the location, a home in a residential area not far from the city center. Officers were sent to investigate. Among them was Officer William Buechner, 38 years old, a respected member of the Auburn Police Division. He was a husband, a father, and a well-known figure in the community, calm under pressure, dependable, and committed to his oath. Riding alongside in separate vehicles were Officer Webb Sistrunk and Officer Evan Elliott, both dedicated to protecting Auburn's residents. They didn't yet know who was inside the home or how serious the dispute might be. What awaited them was far more dangerous than anything they could have imagined. The man inside was Grady Wayne Wilkes, 29 years old, a former member of the Alabama National Guard. He had a history of military service, training that made him skilled with weapons and tactics. On this night, he wasn't just upset. Prosecutors would later say he was mentally unstable, caught in the turmoil of a personal domestic conflict. Instead of answering the door in plain clothes, Wilkes was ready for war. He wore a military-style helmet and full-body armor. He carried a rifle. The patrol cars pulled up, their emergency lights flashing softly against the suburban houses. The officers approached with professionalism, prepared to talk, to calm things down, to resolve whatever is happening inside. But before they could even begin a conversation, Wilkes made his choice. In an instant, gunfire erupted. The quiet Alabama neighborhood was shattered by the sharp, cracking sound of bullets. Wilkes opened fire directly at the officers, his military training evident in the precision of his attack. Officer William Buechner was hit. The impact was fatal. He fell, gravely wounded, before he could take cover. Officer Webb Sistrunk was struck and badly injured. Officer Evan Elliott was also wounded. The officers scrambled to escape the line of fire, using what cover they could find, their radios calling out the emergency. Officer down. Shots fired. Neighbors ducked for safety. Some peered through blinds, frozen in shock. Others lay flat on their floors as bullets cut through the night air. This was no longer a domestic disturbance. It was an armed assault on law enforcement. Wilkes remained barricaded inside for a short time, but as more officers arrived and the situation escalated, he slipped away into the darkness. His escape triggered what would become one of the largest manhunts in Auburn's history. Word spread quickly. Across radios, across news alerts, the message was the same. A police officer had been killed, 2 others wounded, and the shooter was on the run. The search began immediately, involving not just Auburn police, but the Lee County Sheriff's Office, Alabama state troopers, and federal agents. Roadblocks were set up. Helicopters hovered over neighborhoods. K-9 units swept the surrounding woods. Residents were urged to stay indoors, lock their doors, and call 911 if they saw anything unusual. Back at the scene, medics worked frantically to save the lives of the wounded. Officer Sistrunk and Officer Elliott were rushed to the hospital. Both were in serious condition, but alive. Officer Buechner's body was covered with the American flag, and fellow officers stood solemnly nearby. The weight of a loss hung heavy in the humid Alabama night. The manhunt stretched into the early hours of the morning. Every officer involved knew they were searching for someone armed, dangerous, and willing to kill again if cornered. Wilkes' military experience made the search even more tense. He could survive outdoors, move quietly, and use terrain to his advantage. By sunrise, the community was awake but unsettled. Schools delayed openings. Businesses posted signs urging prayers for the Auburn Police Division. Social media filled with photographs of Officer Buechner, his warm smile, his crisp uniform, his family standing proudly beside him. Then, at around 7 a.m. the following morning, the search came to an end. Officers spotted Wilkes and moved in. This time, there was no gunfire. He was taken into custody without further violence. The arrest was announced quickly, bringing relief to a shaken city. The news conference that followed was somber. Auburn Police Chief Paul Register spoke carefully, his voice edged with grief. He confirmed the details. Officer William Buechner was dead. Officers Webb Sistrunk and Evan Elliott were recovering from their wounds, and the suspect, identified as Grady Wayne Wilkes, was in custody. Chief Register thanked the agencies who assisted in the search and expressed his condolences to Buechner's family. In the hours and days that followed, tributes poured in from across Alabama and beyond. Flags were lowered to half-staff. Police departments from other states sent messages of solidarity. At the Auburn Police Division headquarters, flowers and notes of support covered the front steps. For the officers who had been there that night, the memories were vivid and raw. What began as a routine call had turned, in seconds, into a deadly ambush. For Officer Buechner's family, the loss was unbearable. He had kissed his wife goodbye that evening, expecting to return home. He never did. The people of Auburn struggled to make sense of it. How could a dispute inside one home explode into such violence? How could a man who once wore a U.S. military uniform turn his weapon on those sworn to protect the community? The answers would emerge slowly in courtrooms and interviews. But in those first days, there was only grief. The morning of May 20th, 2019, came with a heavy silence over Auburn, Alabama. The manhunt for Grady Wayne Wilkes had ended with his arrest just hours earlier, but the shock of what had happened the night before was far from over. In neighborhoods where children usually waited for school buses, people now stood quietly on their porches, speaking in hushed voices. The flags in front yards and at government buildings hung low at half-staff, a symbol of the loss that had struck the heart of the city. Wilkes, 29 years old, had been taken into custody without further violence. He was still wearing parts of his tactical gear when officers found him, remnants of the body armor and helmet that had turned an already dangerous night into something far deadlier. The fact that he surrendered peacefully after so much bloodshed only deepened the questions swirling in the community. At the Auburn Police Division headquarters, the day began not with routine briefings, but with grief counseling sessions and silent moments of reflection. Officers who had served alongside William Buechner tried to process the loss of a man they had worked with for years. Buechner, 38, had built his career in law enforcement on professionalism and calm judgment. He was the kind of officer who could talk someone down from the edge of a bad decision, who could de-escalate a tense moment with a steady tone and careful words. The night before, all of that had been cut short in seconds. In the hours following Wilkes' arrest, investigators began piecing together the sequence of events. They interviewed neighbors, family members, and the officers who had survived the ambush. They gathered physical evidence from the scene, bullet casings scattered across the yard, the damaged patrol cars, the gear Wilkes had been wearing. Every detail mattered, because soon the case would move into the courts, and the full truth would need to be told. It became clear that the confrontation began with a domestic disturbance, call placed from the home where Wilkes had been staying. Prosecutors would later say that the situation inside the home was tense even before the police arrived. Wilkes had been agitated, unstable, and in conflict with someone close to him. Whether it was an argument that spiraled out of control or a deeper mental health struggle, something had pushed him to arm himself with military precision. When officers Buechner, Sistrunk, and Elliott arrived, they approached according to their training, expecting a conversation first. But in those crucial seconds, Wilkes emerged armed, wearing protection that most people only saw in combat zones. His shots came fast and without warning. The injuries to the surviving officers told the story of just how sudden the violence had been. Officer Webb Sistrunk, a veteran on the force, had been hit and rushed into emergency surgery. His recovery would be long and difficult, but his survival was a relief to his colleagues. Officer Evan Elliott's wounds, though serious, allowed him to recover more quickly, yet both men carried the emotional weight of that night as much as the physical scars. For the people of Auburn, this was not just a police matter, it was personal. The city had never experienced the death of an officer in the line of duty in this way before. Candlelight vigils sprang up in public parks. People left flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes at the police station and at the site where Officer Buechner had fallen. The investigation into Wilkes' background revealed the contradictions in his life. As a member of the Alabama National Guard, he had trained to protect others, to work within a disciplined and structured environment. Yet, in civilian life, he faced personal struggles that friends and acquaintances said were difficult to understand. Some described him as polite and quiet. Others recalled moments when his temper or mood shifts raised concern. On the day after the shooting, local and state media were careful with their language. They reported the facts as confirmed by law enforcement. 1 officer killed, 2 wounded, suspect in custody. The details of Wilkes' mental state and the domestic dispute remained largely undisclosed to the public. Still, the image of a man in military gear firing on police officers in a suburban neighborhood was enough to leave the entire state stunned. At Officer Buechner's family home, the reality of the loss was setting in. His wife, their children, and extended family members faced an empty space where his presence had always been. The Auburn Police Division assigned officers to support the family, to handle logistics, and to shield them from the sudden wave of media attention. Meanwhile, prosecutors in Lee County began preparing the charges against Wilkes. The most serious was capital murder, a charge reserved for the most severe crimes, including the killing of a law enforcement officer in the line of duty. Additional charges of attempted murder would follow for the shootings of officers Sistrunk and Elliott. These charges ensured that the case would move forward with the highest possible stakes. In the days that followed, Auburn became a place of public mourning. The funeral for Officer William Buechner was attended by hundreds of law enforcement officers from across the region, along with community leaders, state officials, and residents. Rows of patrol cars from different jurisdictions lined the streets, their lights flashing in silent tribute. Bagpipes played as the casket, draped in an American flag, was carried past officers standing at attention. The service was both a farewell and a reminder of the risks that police officers face every day. Speakers at the funeral spoke of Buechner's dedication, his kindness, and his commitment to service. They spoke, too, of the night he died, and how quickly routine can turn to tragedy in their line of work. Back at the Lee County Detention Facility, Wilkes awaited his first court appearance. His arrest had been straightforward, but the legal process ahead would be long. Defense attorneys would eventually raise questions about his mental health and state of mind, while prosecutors would focus on the deliberate nature of his actions, the body armor, the helmet, the choice to open fire without provocation. Even as the legal case began to form, Auburn was still reeling from the impact of the attack. Officer Sistrunk's slow but steady recovery became a point of hope for many, a sign that not all of the night's wounds would end in loss. Still, the city carried the knowledge that it had lost one of its own, and that the trust between community and police had been tested in a way no one expected. For the officers who were there that night, the memories of the approach to the house, the sudden gunfire, and the scramble for cover replayed over and over. They spoke quietly among themselves, avoiding public attention, but their testimonies would eventually become part of the official record. The story of May 19, 2019, was no longer just a local crime. It had become a defining moment in Auburn's history. It was about the loss of Officer William Buechner, the survival of officers Sistrunk and Elliott, and the capture of a man who had turned a domestic dispute into a deadly confrontation. But for all the public ceremonies, the press conferences, and the official statements, the most difficult parts of the story were still to come. The courtroom proceedings, the examination of Wilkes' actions and intentions, and the ultimate decision on his fate would all unfold in the months ahead. For now, Auburn was left with a sense of unresolved grief, mourning a fallen officer, supporting the wounded, and bracing itself for the long pursuit of justice. The streets had returned to their quiet routines, but the memory of flashing lights, urgent radio calls, and the sound of gunfire on that Sunday night remained close beneath the surface. The months following the night of May 19, 2019, were marked by a careful, deliberate march toward justice. Auburn, Alabama, was still carrying the weight of the tragedy. Every step in the legal process brought the events of that night back into focus. The gunfire, the loss, and the lives forever changed. Grady Wayne Wilkes sat in custody at the Lee County Detention Facility, charged with capital murder for the killing of Officer William Buechner, and 2 counts of attempted murder for the shootings of Officers Webb Sistrunk and Evan Elliott. Additional charges related to the possession of body armor during a violent crime were also filed. From the start, the case was clear in its facts. There was no question about who pulled the trigger, but the law required that every detail be proven in court. Prosecutors, led by the Lee County District Attorney's Office, built their case methodically. They gathered evidence from the crime scene, ballistic reports linking Wilkes' rifle to the rounds fired, the tactical gear he had been wearing, and body camera footage that captured the moments before and after the ambush. They called upon the surviving officers, the first responders, and the investigators who pieced the night together. Wilkes' defense attorneys did not dispute that he fired the shots, but they began shaping their argument around his mental state. They suggested that the events were driven by psychological instability, pointing to his erratic behavior and strained personal relationships before the shooting. It was an argument that aimed to shift the focus from intent to impairment. Meanwhile, the community kept its attention on the case. Officer Buechner's family attended every major hearing, sitting quietly in the courtroom, their presence a steady reminder of the cost of the crime. Officers Sistrunk and Elliott, still dealing with the aftereffects of their injuries, also made appearances, their testimony expected to be some of the most emotional in the trial. The trial began in earnest more than 2 years after the shooting. Security was tight. The courtroom filled quickly each day. Prosecutors opened with a direct, unflinching narrative. They described how Officers Buechner, Sistrunk, and Elliott responded to a call they believed could be resolved peacefully, only to be met with military-grade firepower. They presented photographs of the gear Wilkes had chosen, the helmet, the armor plates, the rifle, and argued that these were the choices of a man preparing for a violent confrontation. When Officer Sistrunk took the stand, his account was measured but deeply personal. He recalled the approach to the house, the first sight of Wilkes in the doorway, and the sudden spray of bullets. He described falling, trying to move to cover despite his injuries, and hearing the chaos as his colleagues were hit. Officer Elliott's testimony echoed the same sense of shock, that in an instant, a routine response became a fight for survival. The prosecution also called forensic experts who explained how the trajectory of the bullets and the placement of shell casings matched the officers' accounts. The body camera footage, though difficult to watch, confirmed the rapid escalation and the deliberate nature of the shooting. When it was the defense's turn, they leaned heavily on the argument that Wilkes' mental health had deteriorated in the months leading up to the shooting. They spoke of paranoia, depression, and a belief that he was under threat. They did not dispute that he had killed Officer Buechner, but asked the jury to consider whether his actions were the result of a mind in crisis rather than calculated malice. At one point during the proceedings, Wilkes himself addressed the court, offering a statement that was described by reporters as subdued and halting. He expressed regret but stopped short of offering a direct apology to the Buechner family. His words were seen by some as an acknowledgement of what he had done, though prosecutors argued they lacked true accountability. The turning point in the trial came when the prosecution replayed the moment from the body camera footage, showing Wilkes opening fire almost immediately upon the officer's arrival. The lack of any verbal exchange before the shots, the readiness of his stance, and the protective gear he wore all supported the claim that this was a deliberate act. The jury watched in silence. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. Deliberations were tense, lasting more than a day. The verdict, when read, was clear: guilty of capital murder for the killing of Officer William Buechner, and guilty of attempted murder for the shootings of Officers Sistrunk and Elliott. There was no ambiguity in the decision. The sentencing phase followed. Under Alabama law, a capital murder conviction in the killing of a police officer carries the possibility of the death penalty. The prosecution argued that the gravity of the crime, the deliberate targeting of officers in the line of duty, warranted the harshest sentence available. The defense urged the court to consider Wilkes' mental state, his military service, and the potential for life imprisonment without parole instead. In the end, the court delivered its decision: death by lethal injection for the capital murder of Officer Buechner. For the attempted murder charges, Wilkes received additional life sentences, ensuring he would never walk free again even if the death sentence were overturned. The sentencing brought a measure of closure, but it could not undo the loss. Outside the courthouse, members of the Auburn Police Division embraced the Buechner family. Chief Paul Register spoke briefly to the press, saying that justice had been served, but that the department would never forget the sacrifice made by Officer Buechner. For the community, the conclusion of the case marked the end of a long and painful chapter. The vigils, the trial, and the sentencing had all kept the memory of that night alive, and now Auburn could begin to move forward, though the wound would remain. In the years since the shooting, Officer Sistrunk and Officer Elliott returned to their roles in law enforcement, carrying with them the scars, both visible and unseen, from that night. They became living reminders of the dangers officers face, and of the resilience required to continue serving after surviving an attack. As for the Buechner family, the absence of William was a constant reality. His name was added to memorials for fallen officers, his story told at police academies as both a warning and an inspiration. His colleagues spoke of him often, not just in the context of his death, but in the everyday moments of his life, the humor, the dedication, and the calm presence he brought to his work. The case of the tragic shooting of Officer William Buechner became more than a crime story. It became part of Auburn's history. It highlighted the unpredictable nature of law enforcement, the profound impact of mental health crises when left unaddressed, and the way one moment can alter countless lives. For those who knew William Buechner, the justice delivered in court was important, but it was his life, the years of service, the friendships, the family he loved, that mattered most. That was the legacy they chose to remember, even as the official record would forever mark the way he died. From the first knock on a door in a quiet neighborhood to the final words of a judge in a crowded courtroom, the story had been one of sudden violence, relentless investigation, and the pursuit of accountability. It was a story with a devastating beginning, a long and grueling middle, and an ending that, while it brought legal closure, could never restore what had been lost on that May night in Auburn, Alabama.